Hello and welcome everyone back to another episode of the Publisher Lab. I am Tyler Bishop, and joined with me today, as you've probably come to expect at this point, is Producer Manny. Producer Manny, welcome back.
Hey, I'm back, everybody.
Welcome back, listeners. And we have a pretty exciting week ahead of us and behind us in a lot of ways in the world of digital publishing. I feel like we're in this space where I haven't actually felt digital publishing feel so sort of like, I guess, hard to predict, as it really has been over the last probably actually since the start of 2023. I think with AI and a lot of the different things that have happened with big tech, it feels like there's a shift happening. Like there's probably fundamental changes happening within our space. And if you would have looked back 6 months ago and made predictions on a many number of things, I would say that almost the wind is blowing in the opposite direction in many of those respects, or at least what many had expected. And I think that that's one of the things that makes this a really exciting time if you are an independent digital publisher. Is traditionally in areas of major disruption, it's those that are lean and agile that usually succeed. And I think in our space, there's no greater example of that than most of our listeners, I would say, are either individual owner operators or small media company owners. And it's exciting. I like getting out of bed each day and thinking about all the different types of things that have happened and where things might go. And that's exactly what we talk about on this show. So if you just some quick housekeeping before we get right into some of the news of the day. If you want to leave us questions or give us some feedback on the show, that stuff is amazing because it helps us really direct the show in the directions that you want it to go. So, your sort of interests are my interests. So let's talk about those things. And if you have any kind of questions or ideas, you can go to publisherlab.org and there's a easy comment box. You just throw something in there and be more than happy to answer it or take that feedback. So without any further ado, the first news that we have up on the docket today is no surprise. It's in the world of SEO, or the world of Google, if you will. And it's an article that comes to us from Search Engine Journal, and it's Google designated a gatekeeper under EU rules. What it means. So that's the headline. So it's Google and the European Commission. They've decided to sort of incorporate all the big tech giants under this sort of like gatekeeper role, and it's effective March 2024. So a little over 7-8 months away. It'll happen just in the EU, and it'll be enforcing the rules of the quote unquote DMA. So they say it's to promote competition and reduce the dominance of the big tech giants in digital markets. DMA stands for Digital Markets Act. Thank you, Producer Manny, who's like highlighting this on the screen for me. Get yourself a good producer, everybody. It's really, really great. And so Google is, in this case, the one that everybody's going to be paying attention to, obviously, because when you start talking about things like this gatekeeper role, you think about content in terms of like how it's served, who it's served to, and who's responsible. Google is obviously the one, at least from a publisher standpoint, thinking of it in those terms, the one that really makes the biggest difference. And I think everyone sort of was expecting Google to give a lot of pushback. They say that they're going to be cooperating, but cooperation looks differently to a lot of different folks. Google cooperated with GDPR and CCPA, yet they ended up being the ones that sort of dictated the implementation of the law to everyone. You guys know on this show that I have very mixed feelings about regulation within the space, especially whenever the problems are complex and the regulators are unfamiliar and not industry specific. So I would imagine that however this ends up being enacted, at worst, it's an effect, or I guess at worst, it makes the big tech giants more powerful, and at best, it does nothing. I'm not a big fan of a lot of these, because what ends up happening is the onus gets pushed all the way down the chain. So with GDPR, you saw it get sort of like handed off to publishers. So you're the ones now that have to manage consent, have cookie banners and things like that on your website. Yet the whole purpose of the law was basically to crack down on Google and Facebook, and force them to not collect everyone's data and use it for their proprietary advertising, yet somehow they told the publishers that they're responsible for that. So I'm not much more sort of like optimistic about this, but I don't know, Professor Manny. Maybe I'm too cynical. Is there anything here that stuck out to you when you were reading about it that you thought, hey, maybe this could be a good thing?
First thing I thought of is competition is always great, right? So I think that they're trying to promote more competition with smaller tech companies. The concern there is how well is that going to be received by the user? When you have a company like the size of Google or the size of Meta, where they've just been so dominant in the space and many years of just adaptation and improvement of their products, um, how are customers going to like adopt
Yeah.
this? Additionally, Google does plan to consult with experts to balance the compliance with providing good user experience. So they're already kind of like thinking ahead on this, whereas other companies I feel like might be trailing a little bit behind.
Yeah, and I think when you think about how Google usually enacts these things when it comes down to like how they surface results, they've somehow through all the court cases over the years been able to protect pretty much all their intellectual property and all their copyrighted material as it relates to how search works. And so I imagine this will be no different. And so without any form of transparency with it, you'll never even know if it's being effective or it's effectively working. And so I think to me I'm not optimistic about it, but we'll see where it goes. Next up from Google, continuing on in that fashion, Google's a pretty important company in our space. This one comes from Axios, and it's an exclusive. It says Google files motion to dismiss Gannett's ad tech lawsuit. So this is a lawsuit by Gannett versus Google, and it's Google's motion to dismiss this sort of antitrust lawsuit, which there have been several. So not to lose track here, this one was filed in June. It was filed in federal court inside of the U.S., and the allegations are that Google's dominance is harming news publisher revenue. So in a bid to sidestep another legal hurdle here, Google has moved to dismiss the federal antitrust lawsuit. Gannett alleges that it is essentially points to Google's ad tech clout, claiming it's siphoning publisher revenue. Google has said this in many of court cases, but they've cited, and in this one they cited similar allegations that were dismissed last year. With billions at play, they've generally said along these lines that Google is good for publishers, especially news publishers. They're not siphoning money off of it. In fact, they're triaging more audiences to more different types of news publishers. And they're actually right about that. Of all the different lawsuits that come against Google, news publishers I think have some of the weakest in many cases, because I think for news publishers, what you end up with is, do you want a regulatory body to step in and force Google and Facebook and whoever to pay you for listing your content in the news carousel? Because if that's the case, there's no collective bargaining. You're gonna have to bargain with every news publisher, theoretically, that has credibility in the world. And if Google doesn't want to pay your price for the news, then somebody gladly will produce the news for that price. And I think that creates a scenario in which you get basically a race to the bottom on production of content, which is not good for news. And beyond that, even it takes away a bargaining chip as a publisher for you. And I think it potentially scorns your ability to make money if you're a news publisher and you're not listed in the Google News carousel. I think that's pretty harming if you're a company like Gannett. So of all their different antitrust lawsuits, now this one is pointing towards ad tech in general, and so I think that this is one of the areas where I'd have to get into the actual the letter of the law of how exactly that they've positioned this lawsuit with them. But their ad tech is something that does raise and ring a lot of alarm bells when you start looking at sort of like antitrust and what it means. So Google has a dominance in search. We've talked about this before. They also have a dominance in browsers. Now, not quite as dominant. Chrome is not near as widespread in terms of like market share as something like Google search. But beyond having the largest uh, you know, website search engine in the world. They also have the largest video and image search engines in the world. That's right, two. Video and image is the second largest search engine in the world. YouTube is the third. Google owns all three. On top of that, Chrome is the most dominant browser in the world currently, and Google also runs that. Now, both of those things incorporate Google's proprietary, and then you have something like Gmail, which is widespread across the world as well. You do have competitors there, Microsoft. Now, if you really break this down, you look at it and you go, okay, well, Google can collect user data from search. They can collect user data from a browser, from Gmail. That's a lot of information. And then on top of that, when advertisers and publishers then come to the table to buy and sell their ad space or ads, Google also forces them to use their ad server and their ad exchange, which is used by pretty much all the other people that are competing with Google in the ad space. So that looks a lot like Google being the forebearer of all, or gatekeeper, to harken back to our first story, of pretty much everything inside of this ecosystem. Yet no one would claim that ad tech is all that transparent. And Google has very specifically, in many cases, done things to build, their own dominance in this space. So that's what antitrust is using dominance in one space to create competitive advantage in another. And there's several definitions of that. So I don't imagine that this is a lawsuit that Gannett will win. I think that there's better versions of this that are out there, but we'll see how the judge decides, because this verdict will be a very precedent-setting one, I imagine, for years to come. Next up on the agenda, we've got some more social media news. So shifting from one big tech giant to another, this one's slightly smaller. X, formerly known as Twitter. It's one that this one comes from TechCrunch, and it says X, formerly Twitter, challenges California's new transparency laws unconstitutional. So really rough day for me here, producer Manny. We're asking me to be a legal expert. I took one Stanford law class and I did not. I barely passed because I was a nice guy. I was charismatic to the professor. So I don't know. With all this legal news that's out there, with X in the crosshairs, you're a California resident, same as me. Are you optimistic about this new one?
I feel like anytime that X is in the news, I get this sudden hit in the stomach of just, all right, we're talking about this again. So Elon thinks that with the recent California law that passed, or that got signed into a year ago, infringes on his free speech, just because they need X to be accountable for how they're doing content moderation.
Yeah.
However, Elon claims that because they're asking him how he's doing that, that's encroaching on his freedom of speech, because then he might have to change how he does content moderation, which, to my knowledge, especially from the last few weeks that we've talked about it, he doesn't do content moderation.
Yeah, I think he wants to eliminate it. And if that's the case, I would say, I think he has a good point. But the question then becomes, if you do moderate content, there's a difference in my mind too of content moderation and censorship. Now that's probably it's not a black line, it's probably a gray one. But if you think about it, like we talked about this probably 2 months ago on the show, where we were talking about the difference between sort of, the right to free speech and the right to reach. So as long as content isn't being restricted in terms of taken down, and people don't have the ability to sort of communicate on the platform, I don't know that you could make a good argument that it's restricting free speech. Now, if a regulator or state wants to come in and say, hey, we want to know about your content moderation practices, that's a private business, and being asked, how does this private business essentially do something that's proprietary, you can make an argument that content moderation is very difficult, and that could be intellectual knowledge, into IP type knowledge, that essentially intellectual property, something that's proprietary to them that they could potentially even copyright. And if you run a social media company and say you do content moderation, perhaps to circumvent bad actors, you know, having that be transparent potentially empowers these bad actors. So I think in both these cases, I do think that the law should shed light on exactly what does that mean, content moderation. Like, what are the parameters? And I do think that that's something that X would need to provide. But again, I'm not a legal expert. You don't want me to weigh in on it. But as far as the way things have generally fallen as it relates to things like this, it's kind of in that area of like, if you're going to take content down, there needs to be some transparency, and that's why you have like these very specific rules when you look at something like Meta or Facebook. So yeah, we'll see where that goes. Now, as we kind of dig over into the world of AI, which is another one of our favorite topics here on the show, we've got a new one. And actually, Professor Manny, I know you've read a little bit about this one because it comes in a major area of interest for you. Somebody that's very, I would consider an artist. So tell us a little bit more about what happened with artists signing a letter in favor of AI. Is that right?
Yeah, so this is coming from TechCrunch. Artists sign an open letter saying generative AI is good. And this is kind of a follow up from what I was talking about last week, where the graphic design community kind of got nervous about AI early on. But as time went on, those concerns diminished. In a proactive move, artists have penned an open letter to Congress stressing their role in conversations surrounding generative AI. And their message is that AI isn't new in art. Instead, it's another brush in their creative palette, breaking down barriers for budding artists. However, they do hope for a balanced approach. This letter did overlook a lot of intellectual property theft concerns.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of on the same boat as them. As far as AI, I've only used it as a tool. Granted, in certain situations where art styles are being copied. I did also notice while doing research yesterday where Tim Burton mentioned that anytime he sees somebody using AI to replicate his art style similar to Nightmare Before Christmas, it makes him sick. Just because he's like, all the time, effort to create something like that, and then AI is, with a prompt, it's automatically making things that are just as good as the things that he created.
Yeah, and this is something I've given a lot of thought to, and I think you brought this up, and this is probably a lot of our listeners can relate to. AI is a tool, and I think I've heard that a lot, and but I don't hear people get into the specifics of what that looks like, and I can give you some because I think the way that I've seen you use it, and I've the way you just sort of kind of like outlined it as well. When you have something in your head, is somebody that's creative, whether you're a writer or you're a graphic artist, you have something in your mind that you want to put down onto paper, onto a screen. You want to make it come alive. Now, what that process looks like, for a long time has been, very labor intensive. In many cases, you get writer's block, or you get, you have trouble kind of like representing what that looks like in your mind. So having some kind of tool that's able to start to pull some of that down and start to put it out there so that you're not just scrapping, hours of time putting down like a first draft just to get started, or just kind of like a baseline of what you're imagining and then, crumpling it up and throwing it away. I think that that's one of the big values that AI provides. Yesterday, I was working on some research for some content, and I wanted some research basically that was showcasing a point. And I was like, go out and find me some of the most recent, news or information about this and turn it into a diagram. I was using GPT-4 and their new data analyst, like version of GPT-4. And it got me some really cool like diagrams and pie charts, but they were really plain and ugly looking. And so then I was like, well, I like this one and this one. Can you combine these into one chart? Can you give it like a minimalist look, make it black and white, and then drop a key at the bottom? And it did. And it was largely kind of what I was looking for. And then I asked for it to give me a vector file export of it. It did. And then I brought it into a tool and I kind of tweaked it a little bit. And that is something that could have taken me, potentially all day to do the research and find all that kind of stuff. But instead, it took me about half an hour of knowing exactly what I wanted and sort of like how to conduct something. It's like as if you had employees. I don't know that you could make the argument that, employees are somehow harming artists, or like potentially the businesses that artists often work for. But the real question is, at what point is that vision in your head taking away from somebody else's? So I think it's really clear if you're creative, but the question is then, when is somebody just not being creative? The Tim Burton example is a good one, because it's like, yeah, it took him a long time to come up with it because he was the originator. If somebody comes and rips it off, it's no different than if somebody rips it off anyways. Now, did it lower the barrier for how hard it is to rip him off? Yeah, exponentially. But I think that that's a separate problem. And I think, these artists that are signing this open letter for generative AI, I think it's nice to hear that voice out there, especially if you're somebody that uses these tools. How much of a difference will it make? Probably not much. Sorry, producer Manny.
That's all right.
Next up in the world of AI, so this is one that I specifically was pretty happy about whenever I was reading about it, because it's something that we've talked about internally here in our office, and it's one that I wanted to get into a little bit. And I had actually sent to producer Manny this morning because I thought it might be interesting to our audience. So one of the things, maybe you've noticed this, I certainly have in many different respects, but is GPT getting worse? So we've talked about on this show before about how the popularity of it, when expected to just grow in a linear fashion, it's kind of leveled off and maybe even declined a little bit here recently. I think part of that is just mass consumer adoption. So we talked before about the common person off of the street and how often are they using it. It's not become a part of daily regular user behavior or user habits yet. But part of that may actually be, the efficacy of it. So if you've used it here recently and you found that maybe the answers, or maybe even sort of the direction, or the type of information, or even the prompts that you've used in the past, or sort of like expected it to be able to do, it's not able to do. It's not just you. In fact, this has been widely noticed by data scientists, really across the globe. So Scientific American had an article on this, and it says, yes, AI models can get worse over time, and GPT is no exception. So there's two theories on this, and I'll throw them both at you because it's worth understanding this to be able to see exactly how things play out, and it'll give you a better idea of where maybe you want to fit in terms of AI moving forward. So one thought on this is that GPT-4, if you think back to maybe 6 months ago, when you would use it, it was pretty limited. Half the time the servers were down, or it was too busy, or you would run out of credits, or the response time would just be crazy slow. The reason is because these models are gigantic and they take up a lot of computing power. Even if you have the money and the funds to be able to do it, just coordinating it all and delivering these models to people around the world is not easy. So that's a problem that we've come to just take for granted because of people like Amazon and Google that have these giant clouds, but they're not running anything anywhere close to as intensive as something like a natural language model like ChatGPT, and delivering it to people at scale. So that's expected. So now you'll notice that stuff happens a lot less. And so the thought here is that maybe these models have been broken up to be smaller and maybe more specific, which the general thought right now is, without a major leap in terms of computer storage and computing power, even on the edge. I mean, realistically, everything in this space and everything in terms of infrastructure is leading towards like more edge, more caching, more sort of like, optimizing and compressed, so that what they call like the server side, request, or like what a user would put onto their device, that you're shipping less and less to the client side, client being your device, your computer, your phone, laptop, whatever. So you want to be able to provide basically like a ready rendered product by then. And so natural language models are not that. And so to be able to deliver that, the thought is that you'll have a lot more sort of specific problem solving models or agents, whether it's ChatGPT or whatever in the future, and that ChatGPT, and sort of like anticipation of this, has already done this. And that's why maybe in some cases you're getting these models that are actually light on some of the more deeper elements of the model. That's one theory. Second theory is that all models will drift over time. So you can kind of think about this like a game of telephone, where it's like a model learns and it continues to collect data, but then it's like over time, the model just sort of starts veering off the road. And at first, maybe you're just like, you know, bumping the side of the curb or something like that. But then over time, it's like you're off in somebody's yard. You guys know me, great examples. But yeah, so drift is another sort of like theory or philosophy here. However, the only thing that gives me pause on the drift thing is that traditionally with a drift model, you can sort of like return to baseline, or you have sort of these self-correcting measures in place. So it's very possible that these things are just so like much more complex with something like GPT-4, that it just is a hard problem. But I think it's more likely that if it is drifting, it has more to do with the fact that the way that ChatGPT is being communicated with now and the sorts of things that it's being asked to do are more wide reaching. And to adapt to that, you sort of take away some of the more effective things that it was able to do before. So no one knows. And yeah, it'll be a really interesting story to follow. And our last story from the world of AI today, actually, it revisits the topic we talked about last week, so I won't touch on it too long. But we're primarily talking a little bit about how AI will, essentially in many cases be, it's like the snake eating its own tail, where, do you end up with an echo chamber when you have something like Google search, for example, and ChatGPT, where you're having content be populated and generated off of the information available. That stuff is surfacing in search engines. But what happens whenever, give you guys a good example. I was opening a bank account over the weekend for my wife. She has a business, and I was trying to set up no, makes no difference. So we're setting it up, and I was trying to find out information about different sort of like both classifications for different types of accounts, and then trying to figure out, comparing different banks. So I'm typing in stuff to search results. And one of the answers that came up in the people also asked was exactly what I was looking for. And I click on it, and the information struck me as not probably correct. And so then I searched that specific question again, and I got 3 different answers from 3 different places. And I was like, well, it's not on their website either. So where is this information coming from, and who has it? And so the information to my question was there, and it looks good quality, and by all means, like, it looks to be from credible sources, yet none of it was correct. And because of that, you start to wonder if the person that does know that information decides to publish it somewhere, what happens whenever, the engine or the flywheel of this content creation and sort of credibility checking almost like overpowers the voice of somebody that actually has true expertise. And I think for publishers, the good thing about this is that it lends itself to publishers being needed more within digital publishing. I think that's always been needed. Publishers make content, they're the thing that everything revolves around, but they sit at the end of the chain. So you have all these middlemen that sit in between, but now all these middlemen may actually need the content more than the audience. And I think that that's great news for publishers. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Google has sort of sneakily done this in the follow publishers, or follow this publisher type functionality in there. But if I was you and I was listening to this podcast and I'm worried about Google search, I would put a lot of time and emphasis into building followers in search, at least for now. And speaking of sort of like middlemen, another story that's kind of more so in the industry that I want to point out is producer Manny. You're familiar with not my theory. But it's one that I'm a proponent of, talk about often on the show. Is this universal philosophy of bundling and unbundling? Have we talked about it on the show before? I think we have.
I think we mentioned it on the show very early on. It's the concept of every so often in various forms of media and just businesses where things will go from bundling together and unbundling and then having everything sold a la carte.
Yeah, and I think this is actually this is the example that I would use to describe the universal sort of like theory on this, which is things are always in a sort of cycle of expanding or contracting. There are people that extrapolate this all the way out to the universe expanding and contracting and things along those lines. But it's basically expanding is this idea of things within a system are sort of like growing in their independence, meaning like they see the value in sort of freedom and separation from both each other and free competition. So you can think of this as like a much more sort of like merit independent, non sort of like everyone's on their own type thing. And that's generally what happens whenever, normally, I would say, when I've seen this, especially in the media space, it's usually when the economy is doing really well or there's significant disruption. But then you have this contraction, and contraction usually means that there is the value that's needed or the distance at which all the different parties have sort of like separated from each other gets to the point to where the system is no longer functioning as it should. So then you get this bundling or contraction that happens, and this contraction is essentially the idea that all these different parties within the space to make this system work again must start to work together, and then you get this bundling. And so how this looks in the media space is, you've got a cable subscription, right? Well, remember cord cutting, everybody's getting Netflix, and you're getting all these a la carte like ESPN Plus and Disney Plus and things like that. And it was very easy to see long ago that eventually you were going to end up with this, basically a cable company again, where you got all these channels that you don't need or want. But instead you get all these things a la carte, where it's like you maybe just want to watch one show on Disney Plus or etc. And so Disney and Charter this week have had, and I saw that this was resolved either earlier today or late yesterday. By the time this comes out, it'll be maybe a few days ago. So Disney and Charter were basically at an impasse. This has happened many times before. You get those messages on your TV screen that says this channel may no longer be available soon because the terrible people at Disney or the terrible people at Charter. And this is them negotiating over sort of like how do they share or account for revenue that Disney generates from Disney Plus. And Charter's circumstance, they're like, look, we're bringing you an audience and we have a good deal, but like you're stealing our audience away to put them on your own platform, and you're degrading the content on ours. So how does this work? And I haven't seen the actual deal that they came to, but this is happening in Hollywood with the actor strikes and things like that as well. Because what you're seeing is basically a lot of the people in this space that have been behemoths and been sort of like the gatekeepers of audience and things like that, they're being pillaged as much as they're being disrupted at the moment. And I think what you're seeing is sort of like the disruptors in many cases are now trying to figure out like, can I make it on my own? And they realize they can't. And so yeah, these deals matter a lot because they matter to publishers, because ultimately publishers in every respect in our industry are third-party contractors, whether you like it or not, unfortunately. And that means that these deals end up being negotiated and you're the ones that have to sort of fulfill them. So from a content creator standpoint, the more unique you can make your content, the more valuable you become. Because if you think about something like Disney, no matter what deal that they make, the battle is really over what unique content they have and where it goes. And those that have the most unique or the most popular content, they get paid in either model. And they actually become a bargaining chip. And that's how you can sort of like gain negotiation power in these sort of like large scale discussions. So I would say, my advice to handle, information and news in this environment like this is figure out how do you make your content more unique? Like, how do you make it something that's really hard to duplicate? How do you build a relationship with your audience that's different from the relationship with other people? And yeah, to me, AI or not, this is the fun part because it gives you a chance to be creative. And I think that's really what being a publisher is all about. Is everybody loves to make money, content, the internet, these things I love. It's hard for me to imagine somebody not having the enthusiasm that I have for it. But at the same time, I'm also creative. I like being able to create something new. And I think that the challenge of being asked to do that is exciting. And hopefully it's exciting to all of you. And if you've had a chance to like or write a review wherever you listen to your podcast, those things are super helpful for us. It helps us continue to take your feedback, but also grow the show and put more time and energy into it. But I think that's it. Producer Manny, anything else today?
No, I think we had a great show. There's a lot of great topics. If anyone has any questions or wants to expand on anything that we talked about today, feel free to comment. Send your questions over to publisherlab.org, and then we'll see you again next week.
She said it best. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next time on the Publisher Lab.